camp that existed in Clearmont during the war and just a little afterward. And I can't add much more to that, except that I've known her since she was like that high.
Yeah, he used to be our telephone man in Clearmont.
Yeah.
Everybody in Clearmont knew and liked Mike, so.
Well, I'm glad to hear that.
As far as I know anyway, so. Is that loud enough? Too loud? I don't want to blow anyone's eardrums out. Okay, good, that's good. Well, for one thing, how many of you have ever heard of the POW camp in Clearmont? I am amazed. There's quite a few people that have. Most people when I talk to, they have no clue that it ever happened. But it, during the World War II, for one thing, the Americans, when they would take some of these Germans and Italians prisoner, they wanted some places to put them where they knew they wouldn't escape and rejoin the army, were better than to bring them across the ocean. So by boat and train and however, they brought these German and Italian prisoners of war to the U.S. and put them in camps. And there was actually a camp, some kind of a camp in every state in the Union except Nevada, North Dakota, and Vermont, actually. And there were several in this area. There were 175 branch camps and 511 area camps. This is through the whole U.S. housing 425,000 POWs. 371,000 were Germans, 500,000 were Italian, and about 3,000 were Japanese. That, of course, didn't include the internment camp of American-raised Japanese. This was just the prisoners of war. The first one they started was in 1943, but the one in Clearmont didn't start until 1945. However, the first one in Wyoming was Douglas, and it did start in 1943. They brought in the prisoners to help, especially in Clearmont and some in Douglas too, in the sugar beet fields. We had a lot of sugar beets in the Clear Creek Valley at one time before Holly Sugar moved the whole operation over to Worland. So they needed help topping the beets and harvesting the beets, and most of the POWs at the Clearmont camp were working in these beet fields. The camp was called Branch Camp Number 7, was activated June 4th of 45, and closed for good in November of 1945, so it was pretty short-lived there. But the people of Sheridan got together and organized the Sheridan County Labor Agency. The purpose was to bring in labor. The POWs that they had were from mainly the Douglas camp. There's also a main camp in Greeley, Colorado, and Scottsbluff, Nebraska, and Belfouche, South Dakota. But most of the Clearmont prisoners were German, and they came from the Douglas camp. And had a long list of how they had to house them, make sure they were warm and everything. But they were purchased from a CCC camp, Civilian Conservation Corps camp in Gillette, and moved to a tract of land near Clearmont. Right now, Roeblings, Gary Roebling and Ann Roebling own that. It sits kind of behind the Catholic Church in Clearmont. I don't have a picture of that, unfortunately. But the prisoners were housed there every night. The land was actually leased from Holly Sugar Corporation. They had a lot of the land in this area to grow the sugar beets. The prisoners were housed there every night and worked in the beet fields during the day. Rose Fowler, who was still alive, she's passed on now unfortunately, was the one I talked to about it. And she remembers the first day her and her husband went to get the 14 men that were assigned to work in their beet fields. As far as I know, unless somebody comes up with anything else, this is the only photo that I know that exists of any of the prisoners at the camp, and there were no pictures that I know of that were taken of the camp. It was kind of kept under wraps and they didn't want you taking pictures of it. But this a gun and dressed in a U.S. Army uniform. His name was Burdett Anderson, but he told him to call me Andy. So when Andy arrived, he put his gun in the kitchen, made himself comfortable in an easy chair with some comic books. I said, Andy, shouldn't you be out in the field guarding these prisoners? Andy laughed, nothing to worry about. These men aren't going to run away in those dry, barren hills. Which, from the Clearmont camp, I didn't hear of any escapees from there. However, there were some attempts from Douglas camp, and 2 of the men escaped. They made dummies to sit in their bed so the guards would think they were still in bed. And they got about, 30 miles from the camp and got captured because they asked somebody what state they were in. And just for reference, Douglas to Nebraska is 107 miles, Douglas to Idaho, 365, Douglas to Montana, 232, and Douglas to the Colorado line is about 128. So they had a long ways to go to get out of Wyoming. I thought that was kind of funny, though. What state are we in now? Rose continues. The men varied in ages from their early 20s into their 40s. Most of them were pretty young, really. They were friendly, polite, and anxious to please, and took much pride in doing a good job. Some had been journalists, painters, carpenters, farmers, and other skilled laborers. Albert Nuss was a pianist. He always ate his lunch very hurriedly so he could play the piano. He entertained us all. One thing, too, that Rose was telling me, most people, a lot of people anyway, eat peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. That's kind of a kid's staple. Well, in Wyoming, honey was more usually available than jelly a lot of the time, so we had peanut butter and honey sandwiches. And that's what Rose fed a lot of these people for lunch, and they just loved it. They thought that was the greatest sandwich they ever ate, was peanut butter and honey. Some of them could speak and write good English, and some could not. There was only one man who seemed aloof, according to Rose, and the other men nicknamed him Superman because he was the only one of the ones that they had working for him that kind of was a Nazi and stayed true to the Nazis. A lot of the others said, this is not our war, it's Hitler's war. And they were just as glad to be here instead of back in the army. And then Dick Lenz, who had another camp, remembers that he worked with 3 of the fellows in his father's beet fields. One of them was Franz Snyder, about 33, and Hugo Tascher, who was about 43 at the time that he was at the Clearmont camp. They went into service together, were captured together, and the last we knew, they were in a prison camp in England, still together. That was kind of interesting, I thought, yeah. In the Douglas camp was where we got the prisoners from. Some of that actually still remains. Down in Douglas, the Oddfellows Hall here was at one time the officers' barracks for the POW camp. It housed not only German but Italian, a lot of Italian prisoners. Some of them painted murals on the wall that still exist today down at that Oddfellows Hall. fascinating. Mike Kazara, I talked to him the other day, thanks Mike, told me that a longtime Clearmont resident who's passed on now, Cameron Campbell, he came back wounded from World War II, and he could sit on his back porch. I kind of know where his house was, it kind of faced the camp, and he'd watch them load the POWs into the old trucks, like the one in that picture, to take them out into the beet fields. He said there was one prisoner in the camp, now whether it was the Superman Rose referred to or another one, he tried to talk them into revolting, and the other prisoners beat him up because they didn't want to leave. And they were really treated quite well at these camps around here, much better than what the American prisoners got treated in Germany. And they were really pretty free, sounded like. I mean, it wasn't like they were, herded into the barracks every night. One of them was actually a coach at Clearmont School for a while. His name was Sergeant Clark. And I guess one guy said it was kind of an education to listen to him cuss in German whenever they goofed. And then another one, this was from Erin Coop Quartermain. I think we have some of her relation in here today. Anyway, one of the German prisoners, and she was working at the beet dump in Clearmont, where they would run the trains under the conveyor belts to put the beets on the train. Anyway, she was working there, weighing out the beets. Says one day, one of the prisoners came to the door of the little hut where I was working, the weighing shack, and said hi, handed me a note, and scurried off. His note asked me to meet him down by the creek that evening and get acquainted. I shared the note with Melvin Roebling, who was working with me, and that made something exciting for us to talk about for several days. You guessed it, I didn't meet him. But, they were pretty free to move about the town of Clearmont, sounds like, really there, when they weren't working in the beet fields. Anyway, the camp was closed down completely in 1945. That must have been right about the end of the war, wasn't it? I'm not sure exactly when the war ended. September 45.
September 2nd.
Thank you. I'm going to write that down so I know. Very good. Okay, September 2nd, 45. I wasn't here, so I didn't know. Anyway, and so then, of course, the prisoners went back to Germany, German prisoners. But some of them actually corresponded with the people here in the U.S. that they'd worked for. And some corresponded with Rose Fowler in late 1945. The one POW told of a shortage of food, bombed homes, and the miserable conditions in Germany at the time. It says many were near starvation. In 1948, Herman Eckhart wrote, this is to Rose again, when I was working with you in the U.S., I was weighing about 175 pounds. Now, after 2 years being home, I'm down to 130 pounds. So that was starvation, guys. Although conditions were bad, Eckhart said, it gives me great pleasure to think of the time when I was working with you in the sweet beets. I always kind of like that, sweet beets. Let's say sugar beets, sweet beets. It was pretty cool. At the time, I was feeling like a free man. I was well off, even though I was a prisoner of war. One is rather ashamed to know how bad the Allied prisoners were treated under the Hitler regime. But not all the Germans can be blamed for that. There were many decent fellows among them. Of the other comrades, I didn't hear from again, or did I see any of them. Superman once wrote me a letter, but I couldn't trace his address. Albert Nuss, who played the piano so well and entertained the Fowler family, wrote in 46 that people get only 800 to 1,000 calories a day. And that is too small for poor people. And Rose added too that many people in the area kind of held it against the farmers for hiring these prisoners, saying, you know, they had to be sympathetic to the Nazis or something, but she said, we just needed help. And we really didn't care as long as they'd come work for us, what their ideology was. And many of the Germans said in later letters, this is not our war, this is Hitler's war. And a lot of the people up and down the Clear Creek Valley, it was settled a lot by German, people of German heritage. And because of that, I think they probably felt a little kinship towards the Germans. And they had a pretty good relationship with most of them that way. In 1948, the buildings of the camp were sold. Now, I hear varying reports. Somebody said that the interior of the Red Arrow, which is actually now destroyed, but it was a cafe in Clearmont, growing up way outside of Clearmont, that my granddad or my dad must have bought one of them, because that's kind of where I got interested in it, because we used it to keep coal for our coal stoves, and it was one of the buildings, and it was just a frame shack with tar paper outside, kind of like a lot of homestead cabins. And I wish I'd have got pictures of it, but I didn't, unfortunately. It's gone now too. And today there isn't, you know, anything really left of the camp. It's on private land. Roeblings own it. And it's just a really interesting part of Clearmont history that there's really nothing left of it right now. I mean, at least the Douglas camp, you can kind of see a little bit of that left over. Back to the Douglas camp. That's the Officers Club, which the IFO building there is. Interior walls of the club are painted with 16 large, colorful murals, most of them over 6 feet tall, and 3 of the Italian prisoners who are known today only by their signatures on the murals. V. Finati, E. Tarquinino, and F. Di Rossi. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing them right, but anyway. They have been identified as copies of Western paintings by William Henry Jackson and Charles Russell. And the club was placed on National Register of Historic Places in September of 2001. Talk about the escape. I mentioned the escape attempt using the paper dummies, but another I was reading, they have a little book, I think it's called The German-American Experience in Wyoming or something like that. He said that there were some prisoners from Douglas that got to know the man that they were working for so well, he sponsored them to come back to the U.S. It would be interesting to know who he was, if any of his descendants are still living in Douglas. Okay, well, are there any questions about the POW camp or any other POW camps? Or... Yes, sir?
I knew of these camps because of the book called The White Route, and I don't remember who the author was. You probably do.
I do, but I probably can't pull it off the top of my head right now.
Yeah, but I think that it's
yeah,
probably,
Iberland, yeah, Dolly Iberland.
and
Yeah.
it's probably down at
Thank
the
you.
library, and if people want to know a bit more about it, I thought it was a real interesting book.
Yeah, I'll have to read up on that because I didn't realize she mentioned the camps. So, very good. Thank you, sir. Okay.
How many did they, do you know how many prisoners they had at Clearmont?
200.
200.
200, yeah. And it was kind of flexible, I think. You know, I think they probably, you know, as they needed them from Douglas. But this the first article I wrote said there were 200, and I have a bunch of like manpower days and things like that they worked there. But it's all pretty governmental and technical and things like that, but, yes ma'am.
Yeah, you mentioned that the family, one of the families that had the workers there didn't mind paying them to work because they just needed it. Did they actually pay the prisoners, or was the U.S. Army paid money?
I think the U.S. Army paid them so much. One man I was reading about, okay, here we go, yes. The German POWs provide thousands of hours of agricultural labor for which they were paid daily wages of $4.
Oh,
They received one half of their wages in scrip they could use in the post-exchange. Other half was set aside until their release from the camp. Some thrifty prisoners returned their homeland with over $500 in savings, which is about equivalent $6,000 today. So yeah, so they, you know, they were treated well, they even got paid, you know, much better than, I don't know if you heard Val Burgess's talk about the Germans that held the American prisoners. They had horrible conditions, where we treated these guys, you know, really nice, actually. And most of them really didn't want to go back, at least not during the war.
They had to go back.
Well, they had to go back to Germany afterwards, but, you know, they didn't really want to fight very bad again. They preferred to stay here and harvest beets, I think.
I went to school with a young German, and it wasn't really a German, he was an Italian. And he was conscripted by the Germans into the German army.
Mm-hmm.
They just rolled into his village, which was in the Italian Alps.
Right.
And he was 15 years old, and they just grabbed him up and took him,
Yeah,
along with anybody else they could find. And he was brought to one of the camps in the United States, and at the end of the war, he was given a chance to join our army and on a path to citizenship. He joined the army, spent 2 years, and went through then his necessary steps to get his citizenship and became a citizen, and I went to school with him. And he was an interesting fellow. His name actually was Raikauskas, and but he was Italian, living in the Italian Alps, and he was going to Northrop Aero Institute with me, and he talked quite a lot about the being a prisoner in the United States was just an idyllic thing, according to them, because he said he didn't know of anybody in the camps that wasn't happier about being in the United States in these camps than in the German army. And he said he was just delighted when he got picked up by the, captured
Right,
by the Americans.
Well, that sounds like a lot of these prisoners, they really, you know, preferred it here over going back to the army for sure, so. Yes?
I know you and I worked at the Red Arrow Cafe, but do you remember how many buildings there were at the POW camp?
You know, I don't know if any of my research actually said how many there were. There might be some in some of this paperwork,
Okay,
but I don't really know how many. Do you know, Mike, how many buildings there were?
At least 6 of them ended up over there where Thornrider Park is now, and there was temporary veterans housing.
Okay.
Longtime resident Ray Yates said he thought that a couple of those prisoners actually came back to the States on a vacation and visited Clearmont to show them where they'd been kept for a while. And one of the other things, Cameron Campbell, who was wounded on the bridge at Remagen, said that battle where he was wounded was so intense, there were so many bullets being fired back and forth across the river, and the Germans were trying to blow it up. They didn't want the Americans to go across it. He said there were so many bullets going across there that there wasn't hardly a place where a bullet didn't hit, and it cut the wires to the explosives. And when they made it across the bridge finally, there was still one German left over there pushing on the detonator, trying to get the bridge to blow up when they went across the other side. So he said it was kind of an unusual experience to sit there in his wheelchair after he got home and look across the canal and see maybe some of the guys that he had been fighting against over there. And so it was really, it was very informal, because when they were loading the prisoners on the truck, they'd help them in the back. The soldier would give them his rifle. They'd help him on the truck and give him his rifle back, and then they'd go off to do the beats. And then you were talking about the prisoners who had 30 miles and didn't know what state they were in. You know, if you've been over to Europe, it's like if you drive from Sheridan to Billings, if you're in Europe, like you might be in a different country.
Mm-hmm, right.
Well, we had an exchange student from Finland, and we were living in Sheridan at the time, and he wanted to ride with me on one of my jaunts with range telephone, and we went through Clearmont and down to Spotted Horse and clear out on the other side, and everything else, and went clear back in the hills to some ranch, and came back, and we got back home and asked, "Where have you been?" And he says, "I don't know." He says, "I think it was halfway across the United States." So when you're from Europe and then you travel these distances in Wyoming, yeah, it's hard to get your head around that stuff when you first.
Well, just like they say, the difference between the British and the Americans is Americans think 200 years is a long time, the British think 200 miles is a long ways.